Someone is quietly planning something beautiful for you. I know that's a big sentence to begin with, but before you decide whether it feels possible, before your mind starts looking for reasons why it couldn't be true, I want you to stay here with me for just a moment, because what comes through today doesn't feel rushed. It doesn't feel uncertain. It doesn't feel like one of those moments where life is still deciding which direction to go. It feels quieter than that, more settled, almost as if something has already begun behind a curtain you haven't noticed yet. And that's exactly why this first symbol appeared. The High Priestess. People often misunderstand this image. They think it's about secrets, or mystery, or hidden knowledge. But what strikes me most isn't what she's hiding. It's what she's waiting to reveal. She isn't chasing anything. She isn't forcing the story forward. She simply knows that some things become meaningful only when they're allowed to unfold in their own time. That's the feeling surrounding this reading. Someone isn't making a dramatic entrance into your life. They aren't announcing grand intentions. Instead, they're sitting with an idea, returning to it over and over again, thinking about it while driving home, while lying awake at night, while pretending to focus on conversations that suddenly seem much less important than the one playing inside their own mind. What surprises me is how intentional this feels. Not impulsive, not emotional in the fleeting sense, carefully considered, as though every small detail matters. And somehow, you became the center of those details. I don't think you fully realize how often you've crossed this person's thoughts lately. Not because you've done something extraordinary, quite the opposite. It's been the ordinary moments. The way you laughed at something you barely remember saying. A passing comment about a place you've always wanted to visit. A memory you shared without realizing how deeply it landed. You moved on. They collected those moments, almost without meaning to. That's what the High Priestess quietly reminds us of. Real attention is almost invisible while it's happening. People rarely announce that they're remembering you. They simply do. And before long, those memories begin connecting like tiny threads. A conversation becomes an idea. An idea becomes a plan. A plan slowly becomes something real. Which raises a question I wasn't expecting this reading to ask so early. What if the most meaningful things anyone ever does for us begin long before we know they're happening? Because if the answer were yes, then it would also mean that the quietest acts of care often spend the longest time growing when nobody can see them. I think that's something we forget. We're used to noticing the loud moments, the surprise announcement, the grand invitation, the obvious confession, but very few meaningful things actually begin that way. Most of them begin with someone simply paying attention, and then deciding that paying attention isn't enough anymore. That's where this next symbol gently enters the story. Justice. Not in the sense of right and wrong, not as judgment, but as balance. The kind of balance that exists inside someone when they're trying to make sure another person feels understood. Because when someone truly cares, they don't just think about what they want to do. They think about how it will make you feel. That's a very different kind of planning. It means replaying conversations, remembering your expressions, wondering whether one idea feels too much or not enough, changing their mind, starting over, adding another detail, removing something that doesn't feel like you. It's almost like they're holding the experience in their imagination before it ever becomes real. Not because they're uncertain, because they're careful. Careful people don't rush meaningful moments. They quietly edit them again and again until what remains feels honest. I actually think that's why this has taken longer than you realize. Not because they've forgotten, quite the opposite, because forgetting would have been easier. This has stayed with them long enough that it stopped feeling like a passing thought and started feeling like something they would regret leaving unfinished. That's an important difference. There are ideas we enjoy imagining, and then there are ideas that quietly ask to become real. This feels much closer to the second. I can almost picture someone catching themselves smiling for no obvious reason, not because something has already happened, but because they're imagining your reaction, wondering if you'll notice one particular detail, wondering whether you'll understand why they chose it, hoping you see what they were trying to say without needing many words, because sometimes that's what thoughtful people hope for most. Not applause, understanding, and maybe you've met someone like that before. Someone who says very little about what they're feeling, yet somehow expresses everything through what they do. There's another reason justice feels important here. It reminds me that meaningful gestures often come after a long period of quiet observation, almost as though someone's been weighing possibilities. Not asking, what would impress them? But asking, what would actually matter to them? Those are completely different questions. And I don't think the answer arrived all at once. I think it came together piece by piece, one ordinary moment at a time, which makes me wonder about something that feels surprisingly significant. What if this entire plan didn't begin because of one unforgettable conversation, but because of one tiny moment that you barely even remember happening? Because life has a quiet way of revealing what matters to us only after the moment has already passed. Not while we're living it, but afterward. Sometimes you're halfway through an ordinary afternoon before realizing it's the part you'll remember months later. Not because anything extraordinary happened, because someone was there. That's what this next symbol brings to mind. The Five of Wands. What I notice is the moment before clarity. The moment when several quiet thoughts all begin asking for the same answer. I think that's what happened inside this person. Not all at once. Not because of one unforgettable conversation, but because small memories began returning in unexpected ways. A sentence they suddenly heard differently. A smile they remembered more vividly than they expected. The way you listened without interrupting. The way you noticed something that everyone else overlooked. At the time, none of those moments seemed important. Life simply kept moving. So did you. So did they. But memory has a curious habit. It doesn't preserve moments according to how loud they were. It preserves them according to how deeply they made us feel. And sometimes feelings need time before they become clear enough to recognize, I think that's exactly what happened here. This person didn't wake up one morning with a dramatic realization. It was quieter than that. One memory led to another. One ordinary interaction quietly connected itself to the next, until eventually they noticed something they hadn't intended to notice. You seemed to appear in their thoughts more often than anyone else. Not because they were trying to think about you, because their mind kept returning there on its own. That's a very different experience. It's almost surprising when it happens. You find yourself hearing a song and wondering if someone else would enjoy it. Walking past a cafe and remembering a conversation you thought you'd forgotten. Seeing something unexpectedly beautiful and immediately wishing another person could see it too. Those moments don't usually announce themselves. They simply repeat, quietly, patiently, until ignoring them becomes more difficult than acknowledging them. And I wonder if that's the real turning point. Not when they first noticed you, but when they realized they had never really stopped noticing you. There's something deeply human about that, because we often believe important feelings arrive with certainty. The truth is, they usually arrive through repetition, the same person returning to your thoughts in small, ordinary moments until those moments no longer feel accidental. I don't think you were trying to leave an impression. That's exactly why it lasted. Authenticity has a way of staying with people long after polished performances disappear. Maybe that's why this next symbol feels so gentle. The Queen of Pentacles. People often see this image and immediately think about comfort or generosity. But what I notice first is something much quieter. She pays attention to what helps another person feel at ease. Not because anyone asked her to, because she notices. And I've been thinking about how rarely we recognize the value of being truly noticed. Not admired, not complimented, simply noticed. There's a difference. Admiration often focuses on the extraordinary. Attention settles on the ordinary. It remembers the coffee you always order without thinking. The song you quietly turned up in the car one afternoon. The way your face changes whenever you talk about a place that feels like home. The fact that you always pause before answering questions that matter. Or that you laugh differently when you're genuinely comfortable than when you're simply being polite. Those are not dramatic observations. They're patient ones. And patient observations have a curious habit of becoming building blocks. Because meaningful gestures are almost never invented out of thin air. They're assembled one remembered detail at a time. One conversation, one smile, one preference, one forgotten story, until eventually all those small pieces fit together into something that couldn't possibly belong to anyone else. That's what keeps returning to me here. This doesn't feel generic. It feels as though someone has been quietly collecting little pieces of who you are. Not to analyze you, not to change you, simply to understand you a little better than they did yesterday. Maybe that's why certain questions have seemed oddly specific lately. or why someone remembered something you barely recalled mentioning yourself. It wasn't coincidence, it was continuity. They've been paying attention for longer than either of you fully realized. And the interesting thing about attention is that it rarely stays still. Once someone begins noticing another person's world, they naturally begin adjusting their own, almost without thinking. They choose a different cafe because they remember you once said you liked it. They save an article because it reminded them of a conversation with you. They hear about an event and immediately wonder whether you'd enjoy it. They pass a bookstore and slow down because they remember the title you casually mentioned months ago. None of those decisions seem significant on their own. In fact, most of them are so small they disappear into an ordinary day. But when enough small choices begin quietly leaning toward the same person, something subtle has already changed. Life has started organizing itself around the possibility of making them smile. And I can't help wondering if that's the part almost nobody ever notices. Because the beautiful gesture isn't actually the first thing that's been built. The first thing that quietly changed was the way this person began making everyday decisions without even realizing. How often those decisions now included you. And I wonder if that's where this reading quietly turns. Because after spending so much time looking at what this other person has been doing, it's worth asking a different question. What is it about you that made all of those small choices feel worth making in the first place? That's what this next symbol keeps bringing me back to. The Ace of Cups. People often look at this image and immediately think about beginnings, about emotions, about the heart opening. But what catches my attention isn't the cup itself. It's the fact that it overflows. Not because someone forced it to, because it has quietly been filling for a long time. I think people can be like that too. Some people enter a room and leave everyone remembering how entertaining they were. Others leave people remembering how they felt. Those are very different things. And strangely enough, the second kind often leaves the deeper impression. Not because they're louder, because they're steadier. I've been thinking about the people we return to in our minds without really knowing why. Very often, they're the people who made us feel comfortable enough to be ourselves. The people who listened without trying to fix everything. Who never rushed us when we were searching for the right words. Who remembered our excitement over things that seemed too small for anyone else to notice. Those moments rarely feel remarkable while they're happening. They're almost ordinary. But ordinary moments are often where trust quietly begins. Maybe that's something you've done more often than you've realized. Not through grand acts of kindness, not by trying to become unforgettable, simply by being consistent, by showing up in the same genuine way more than once. Consistency has a quiet strength. It tells people they don't have to wonder which version of you they're going to meet. There's a kind of safety in that, and safety is surprisingly memorable. People may forget the exact words spoken during a conversation, but they rarely forget how relaxed they felt around someone who expected nothing from them except honesty. Perhaps that's why this person kept thinking about you long after those conversations ended. Not because you demanded attention, because you never did. There is something quietly reassuring about people who don't need to become the center of every moment. Instead, they make space for other people to feel seen, and those people are often the ones others remember the longest. I wonder if you've underestimated the effect that has not only on this person, but on more people than you probably realize, because kindness isn't always remembered in the moment it's offered. Sometimes it keeps working long after both people have gone home, and that brings me to another thought I wasn't expecting. I don't think the timing of all this is changing simply because someone's feelings became clearer. I think something else has shifted. Not inside your connection alone, but inside this person's life. Something that quietly reminded them that waiting forever isn't the same thing as waiting for the right moment. Because perhaps this is what the Hierophant quietly asks us to consider. Not tradition, not rules, but the moments that teach us something we weren't expecting to learn. I see someone who has lived long enough to understand that some opportunities don't disappear all at once. They simply become harder to reach the longer we convince ourselves there will always be another chance. And I wonder if something like that has happened here, not through one dramatic event, not because life suddenly demanded a decision, but because time has a gentle way of asking questions we can no longer ignore. Maybe they watched another year quietly pass. Maybe they found an old message while scrolling through their phone. Maybe they walked past a place that instantly reminded them of a conversation the two of you once had, Or perhaps they notice something even simpler, that you weren't exactly the same person you were when all of this first began. People change slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize the version of someone you've been remembering is already becoming yesterday, and that's when waiting starts to feel different. Not wrong, just expensive. Because thoughtful people aren't only afraid of making mistakes, sometimes they're even more afraid of missing moments that will never return in quite the same way again. That's why I don't think this new sense of urgency comes from panic. It comes from perspective. There's an important difference. Panic rushes. Perspective prioritizes. It quietly rearranges what matters. Suddenly, the project that seemed so important can wait another day. The errands become less urgent. The excuses that once felt reasonable begin sounding strangely unconvincing. Not because life has become less busy, because someone has realized that certain people deserve more than another postponed intention. That's what feels different now. The planning hasn't become reckless. If anything, it's become clearer. The questions are no longer, should I do this? They're becoming, if not now, then when? I think many of us recognize that feeling. It often arrives without warning, after a conversation with an old friend, after seeing someone you haven't seen in years, after realizing how quickly seasons seem to change. You suddenly understand that meaningful things don't ask for perfect timing. They ask for honest timing, and honest timing rarely announces itself with certainty. It simply reaches a point where staying silent feels heavier than speaking, or where continuing to wait feels harder than taking one careful step forward. That's what the Hierophant quietly reminds me of here. Wisdom isn't always knowing exactly what will happen. Sometimes it's recognizing that a thoughtful action doesn't become more meaningful simply because it's delayed forever. Eventually, care asks to be expressed. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply sincerely, and I can't help noticing one more thing. If someone has been moving from quiet observation to quiet preparation, there's a chance that a few pieces of that preparation have already slipped into the world, small enough to overlook, ordinary enough to dismiss, yet familiar enough that if you think back over the past little while, you may realize you've already seen the first hints without knowing they were connected at all. Or perhaps that's exactly why this next symbol appears, the Queen of Wands. Because when someone has been quietly preparing something meaningful, their attention doesn't suddenly become obvious. It simply becomes a little different. You might notice them asking a question that feels unexpectedly specific, not intrusive, just strangely thoughtful, as though they're trying to understand one small detail they somehow never asked before, or perhaps they seem distracted for a moment. Not because they're uninterested in the conversation, because another thought briefly pulls them somewhere else. Then they're suddenly back again, listening, smiling, almost as if they caught themselves revealing more than they intended. Sometimes it shows up in quieter ways, a conversation that lasts a little longer than usual, a pause before they answer something simple, an unexpected curiosity about a place you once mentioned, or remembering a story you assumed had disappeared into the background months ago. None of those things mean anything on their own. People remember details for all kinds of reasons. That's important to acknowledge. What interests me isn't any single moment. It's the pattern that quietly begins forming when enough small moments lean in the same direction. That's what this card reminds me of. Real intention often leaves tiny footprints before it ever makes a grand entrance. Not because someone wants to be discovered, because it's surprisingly difficult to care deeply about something without letting a little of that care slip into everyday life. Maybe that's why you've sensed that someone seems slightly more present lately. Or perhaps slightly quieter. Not uncomfortable, just thinking. There are moments when people become unusually careful with their words. They rewrite a message before sending it. They hesitate for half a second before changing the subject. They almost ask something personal, then decide they'll wait a little longer. Not because they're hiding something, because they're hoping to get it right. I think that's an important distinction. Careful people often appear mysterious when, in reality, they're simply trying not to rush something that matters. And sometimes preparation requires small disappearances too. An afternoon when they seem unusually busy. A conversation they postpone. A reason they can't quite explain for needing a little extra time. Not because they're moving away from you. Sometimes because they're quietly moving toward an idea they hope will eventually include you. Again, none of these moments prove anything. Life is full of ordinary coincidences. People get distracted. Schedules change. Questions come and go. But every now and then, when thoughtful attention has been growing beneath the surface for a long time, those ordinary moments begin fitting together in ways that only make sense when you look back later. And that keeps bringing me to one final thought. What if the most meaningful part of all this isn't the surprise that's slowly taking shape, but the quiet realization that long before anything is ever revealed, someone has already been finding countless small ways to let you know. You mattered. Or maybe that's why this final symbol arrives so quietly. The Ace of Wands. But what catches my attention isn't the beginning. It's the spark itself. Because a spark doesn't create something meaningful on its own. It simply reveals that something has been ready to catch fire for much longer than anyone realized. And I wonder if that's what something beautiful has meant all along. Not a perfect surprise. Not an expensive gesture. Not one unforgettable moment designed to impress you. Something quieter. Something far more difficult to create. The feeling of being understood. I've been thinking about how rare that actually is. Most of us spend our lives explaining ourselves a little, adjusting our words, repeating stories, clarifying what we meant, hoping someone notices the part we didn't quite know how to say. And every now and then, someone does, without needing another explanation. They remember the things you assumed had disappeared. Not because they have a remarkable memory, because those moments mattered to them. There's a strange comfort in that, to realize that while you were simply being yourself, someone else was quietly learning your world, learning which conversations made your eyes brighten, which subjects made your voice soften, which dreams you spoke about confidently, and which ones you mentioned almost as if you expected no one to take them seriously. Those aren't facts. They're pieces of a person, and perhaps that's the real gift that's been taking shape beneath everything we've talked about. Not the gesture itself, but the message hidden inside it. I've been paying attention. I remember. You didn't have to perform for me to notice you. Sometimes those few unspoken sentences change us more than anything wrapped inside a box ever could. Because feeling understood has a quiet way of softening places inside us that we didn't even realize had become guarded. It reminds us that ordinary versions of ourselves were enough all along. I also can't help wondering about something else. Perhaps receiving this kind of attention feels unfamiliar because you've spent so much of your own life giving it away. Being the one who remembers birthdays. The one who notices when someone seems quieter than usual. The one who asks how things turned out after everyone else has forgotten to ask. People like that often become so accustomed to observing others that they almost forget what it feels like to become the one being observed with the same care. Maybe that's why this feels almost difficult to imagine. Not because it couldn't happen, because being deeply seen can feel surprisingly unfamiliar when you've quietly spent so much of your life making sure everyone else felt that way first. And I have a feeling that's exactly where this story is about to reveal its most unexpected truth. The Seven of Wands. It's the choice. The decision to stop stepping backward. And I wonder whether that decision sometimes has less to do with protecting ourselves than allowing someone else to come a little closer. Because if you've spent a long time being the one who gives, receiving can feel unexpectedly unfamiliar. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Just uncertain. Someone does something thoughtful, and almost immediately your mind begins searching for an explanation. They're probably just being polite. They didn't have to do that. I shouldn't make too much of it. It's interesting how quickly we can accept the responsibility of caring for other people, yet hesitate when someone quietly offers the same care to us. Maybe that's simply because disappointment teaches us to become careful, not cynical, just careful. We begin measuring kindness before we allow ourselves to believe it. Looking for hidden expectations, wondering whether we'll eventually discover there was a condition attached that we simply hadn't noticed yet. That's a very human thing to do. But sometimes care really is just care. Not because people are perfect, not because every gesture carries lifelong meaning. Simply because thoughtful people occasionally choose to express what they've already been feeling for a long time. That's what this symbol quietly reminds me of. Not every meaningful action arrives surrounded by certainty. Sometimes it arrives softly enough that we almost miss it. A message sent without needing the perfect words. A plan that isn't elaborate, only sincere. A moment created not to impress you, but to let you rest inside the feeling of being remembered. Perhaps that's why genuine attention so rarely asks for an audience. It doesn't need applause. It isn't trying to prove itself. It simply shows up in the remembered detail, the extra few minutes someone willingly gives, the question they ask because they genuinely want to know the answer, the small adjustment they make without ever mentioning that they made it. Those moments are easy to overlook if we're only expecting grand declarations. But life has a curious habit. Its quietest gestures are often the ones that remain with us the longest. So maybe this isn't really an invitation to search harder for hidden signs. Maybe it's an invitation to loosen your grip on the belief that every act of kindness must first earn your trust before it can touch your heart. Sometimes receiving asks for a different kind of courage than giving ever did. The courage to let yourself believe that your presence alone could have mattered enough for someone to quietly prepare something with you in mind. And the more I sit with that thought, the more I feel that the deepest part of this reading has never been about what this person is planning. It's about what you'll finally understand about yourself. The moment you realize why they chose you in the first place. Attention, because attention is where care begins. When someone remembers what matters to you, when they make space for your thoughts, when they quietly carry pieces of your story without being asked, they're doing something that often goes unnoticed in a world that moves very quickly. They're telling you, without saying the words, your life mattered enough for me to remember it. I think that's more valuable than we sometimes allow ourselves to believe. We often imagine that the biggest moments are the ones that change us. The grand declarations, the dramatic surprises, the unforgettable days. But when you ask people to look back at the moments that truly stayed with them, very often they remember something much quieter. Someone who stayed a little longer. Someone who listened without checking the time. Someone who remembered a promise everyone else forgot. Someone who noticed the ordinary version of them and decided that version was already enough. Perhaps that's what something beautiful has been pointing toward from the very beginning. Not an outcome, a feeling. The feeling that your presence has been received with genuine care, that your ordinary moments have not been as invisible as they sometimes seemed, that somewhere along the way, without either of you fully realizing it, thoughtfulness quietly became intention, and intention slowly became something waiting to be shared. If that moment arrives, whenever it arrives, I hope you don't feel pressured to compare it to the version you've imagined in your mind. Real kindness is rarely perfect. It doesn't always find flawless words. It doesn't always arrive exactly when we expect. But sincerity has a way of carrying its own quiet beauty. So perhaps the gentlest thing you can do after this reading isn't to search every conversation for hidden meaning, or to wonder whether every coincidence is trying to tell you something. Maybe it's simply to remain open, to let thoughtful moments be thoughtful moments, to allow genuine care to arrive without asking it to prove itself before you've even received it. Because life has a quiet way of preparing its most meaningful moments long before we recognize them. Sometimes they begin with a passing conversation, sometimes with a memory that refuses to disappear, sometimes with someone quietly paying attention while you were simply living your life, and perhaps that's why we began exactly where we did. Someone may be quietly planning something beautiful for you, but the most beautiful part was never the plan itself. It was knowing that, somewhere along the way, without asking for it, without performing for it, without even noticing, you became someone worth remembering. And perhaps that's why we began exactly where we did. Someone may be quietly planning something beautiful for you, but the most beautiful part was never the plan itself. It was knowing that, somewhere along the way, without asking for it, without performing for it, without even noticing, you became someone worth remembering. If this message found you at exactly the right moment, I'd love to know what resonated with you the most. Leave a comment below and share the part of this reading that felt like it was speaking directly to your heart. And if this reading brought you even a little peace, hope, or clarity today, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps this message reach others who may need to hear it. And if you'd like more heartfelt readings like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take gentle care of yourself. And until we meet again, trust that the right things often begin quietly, long before we ever realize they're on their way.